recently at a venue in Mexico, and we had a chance to chat. And this is where I had the idea of inviting you. So again, many thanks. I thought we would start by perhaps talking about and reading about your biography. I didn't know this about you, that one of your grandparents had collaborated on some papers with none other than Sigmund Freud. Tell us about that. Incredible story.
Yes, so my grandfather lived in Vienna and was a teacher of classics. Had the title of professor, but academic high school teachers did in Austria then. And he, I think, went to a lecture that Freud had given at the University of Vienna, or a series of lectures, early lectures on psychoanalysis before Freud was well known, and wrote to him suggesting that the ideas in psychoanalysis might be applied to classical mythology or possibly to popular folklore as well, that there were the kind of psychoanalytical motifs recurring. And Freud wrote back to him and said that he'd been interested in investigating this topic, but he didn't have the expertise to do it, and would David Oppenheim, my grandfather, like to work together with him on that. So David accepted this invitation and joined the Wednesday Circle, a group that met regularly on Wednesday evenings in Freud's apartment. And he presented a couple of papers to that. And then he and Freud started working on a paper called Dreams in Folklore. And they completed the manuscript, but before anything happened to it, and maybe it still was going to undergo further revisions, I don't really know, the famous breach between Freud and Alfred Adler occurred. Adler was kind of perhaps the leading other member of the Wednesday Circle, and Adler, who became famous for developing the idea of the inferiority complex, was challenging the view that neurosis is to be explained always by suppressed sexual feelings, and thought that maybe a sense of inferiority, of loss of power, and so on, could also be a factor in some of these problems. And Freud just rejected this in a very authoritarian way. So my grandfather felt that he had to side with Adler, not, I think, particularly because he thought that Adler was right and Freud was wrong on the substance, but because he did not like the authoritarian way that Freud handled it. He thought that should be an open topic of discussion within the Wednesday Circle. But effectively, Freud's followers moved the matter to a vote, after which Adler and his followers, of whom my grandfather was one, were really forced to resign and to leave the Wednesday Circle. So the paper never got published. My grandfather must have kept it. So this paper was written, I think, I can't remember exactly, but before the First World War, 1912 or something, I suppose. And my grandfather must have kept it in his papers in Vienna. And then in 1938, of course, the Nazis came to Vienna. He and my grandmother were deported to the east, to Theresienstadt. My grandfather died there, but my grandmother luckily survived, returned to Vienna, and she must have left her papers with some non-Jewish friends that she had there, because she was able to retrieve the papers and a few other things, and she brought them to Australia when she came to Australia in 1946, my parents having immigrated to Australia in 1938. So that's how the paper survived, and was then in my aunt's possession, and she eventually brought it to the attention of the Freud archives, and so now it's included in the Freud standard works.
Wow, incredible. Wow. So since we're speaking about the Holocaust, I thought that it would be a nice segue to ask you the following question. And there's also a personal connection to me, because when I was a doctoral student at Cornell, there was a gentleman who was making the rounds, I can't remember his name, at all of the elite universities. He was a famous Holocaust denier who would come under the guise of, look, I'm only coming here for a free, for a debate, right? Freedom of speech, academic freedom. Let's debate whether the Holocaust happened, and if it did, whether it was as serious as it is proclaimed to be. And my position was that, as grotesque as that might be, if we truly believe in freedom of speech, then we have to allow people to espouse such grotesque ideas. And so, what's your take on such a situation, given your personal history with the Holocaust?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you. It's totally absurd to deny that the Holocaust happened. I mean, hard to know of any event that was so meticulously documented by the Nazis themselves, as well as, of course, by the survivors and witnesses and so on. But I am a believer in free speech. I accept John Stuart Mill's view that if you prohibit opposition to views, even views that are, you take for granted that they're true, then those views just become a dogma. And we don't want to hold things as dogmas. We want to hold things on the basis of evidence, and allowing people to argue against them is part of making sure that they're not just a dead dogma. So although it's, as you say, grotesque, I would not prevent somebody from exercising their free speech
Right.
in order to argue that the Holocaust didn't happen. If I would think it's not going to convince anyone anyway. If you say, well, we're not allowed to argue against this, people say, hey, what are you afraid of? It's
Exactly.
much better to have people put the evidence out there showing that this is undeniable that this tragedy occurred.
Well, and I guess, I mean, over the past certainly 15, 20 years, we see a greater penchant for uh, people to try to stifle ideas on campuses that they disagree with. And of course, you've been the victim of such a penchant, given your writings on, for example, euthanasia and infanticide. I believe that there was a petition that was set up to try to get you fired from your position at Princeton. And I actually, last week, exactly a week ago, I was invited to by the Institute for Liberal Studies at the University of Ottawa to speak about how political correctness is stifling the free exchange of ideas on campuses. And then I used examples such as microaggressions and safe spaces and trigger warnings and all of these latest sort of culture of offense buzzwords to make the case that it's absolutely astonishing that these types of developments are happening on campuses. So obviously you've had a very long career in academia. Do you see this problem worsening? And if so, why? And what can we do to reverse it?
Um, I'm not sure that it's really worsening, or at least in my experience, I'm not sure. I certainly hear stories from other places of people who are afraid to say things and challenge things, and that's a problem. I don't see it at Princeton. I think we've had pretty free and open debates on a range of issues, including just recently, of course, we had a group of students called the Black Justice League who made various demands and occupied the president's office. And that led to debates about, for example, the racism of Woodrow Wilson, former president of the university as well as of the United States, and whether we should continue to have buildings or institutions, parts of the university named after him. I think that was pretty open. There was a group of students that opposed the Black Justice League's demands, and I don't think they felt really inhibited in what they were saying. I had both sides of that debate in my class at one point, and we had a pretty good discussion. I don't give trigger warnings in my class, and nobody has ever told me that I've caused some traumatic harm to them or that I should
You've
have.
just been fortunate. Wait, it's coming. Watch my lecture. It's coming.
Okay, well, I hope you're wrong, but we'll have to face it when it happens. But on the other hand, because you asked me whether things are getting worse, various things have been going on for a while, including, as you said, back in 1999 when I came to Princeton, there were attempts to get my appointment rescinded after it was announced. There were protests about my appointment, but Princeton University, took a strong stand in terms of free speech and was not at all moved by those protests. I've heard of other, episodes over the years as well. People I think perhaps, in philosophy, we have an understanding that there ought to be free speech and we ought not to not say things. But I remember I had a colleague, actually, this was a Canadian example, come to think of it. I had a colleague, a friend at in the forestry department at University of British Columbia, who had, this is quite a while back now, probably in the 80s, who had views about why it was wrong to log certain Canadian forests. And he was basically told to shut up or the department wouldn't get any more grants or something like that. So, there's various kinds of threats to freedom of speech in academia, and I agree we need to stand firm against them.
Right. And I truly wish that more professors would sort of take the mantle of speaking, vociferously and clearly against any intrusions of free speech. Oftentimes, I receive emails and other communication from people thanking me for my courage, but the reality is that it shouldn't require courage to be able to speak your mind in the 21st century as an academic, right? It should be something that is a default position, and yet somehow I'm hailed as courageous, and in a sense I am, because I do expect in many cases quite heavy blowback from some folks. But in any case, let's move on to a nexus of where you and I can meet, and that is, as you know, I'm an evolutionary behavioral scientist, and I think, probably the two works that I'm familiar most of yours is your work, Animal Liberation, of course, which we'll talk about in a second, but your other work, a small book on Darwinian left, how to apply the principles of evolutionary psychology to leftist policies. And I thought that was interesting because as somebody who's been entrenched in evolutionary psychology for about 2 decades, I see both sides of the political aisle have antipathy towards evolutionary psychology, right? Guys like Richard Lewontin and Stephen Jay Gould will hate evolutionary psychology because it doesn't jive with their Marxist ideologies. Guys on the right will hate evolutionary psychology because it is a cabal of godless atheists trying to remove God from the picture. And so from every possible political direction, you get guys who hate you because you're an evolutionist. E.O. Wilson famously said, you probably know this quote, communism/socialism, great idea, wrong species, because he was referring to the communism of social ants. So maybe give us a quick synopsis of that book, because many people may not be very familiar with it, and I think it's a great little book.
Yeah, well, it does start really from the kind of insight that you mentioned, that people on the left seem to be hostile to evolutionary psychology because it does go against Marxist views. The Marxist view is that you change the economic structure of society and everything will change with it. And Marx himself is pretty clear in his writings. And I wrote a short introductory book on Marx. He's pretty clear in his writings that human nature will change once you get away from capitalist economics, and that's why we'll be able to have a classless society, and a society in which the motto is, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. And clearly, evolutionary psychology says no, there are things in human nature that are biological, without denying that there are some things clearly that are culturally affected or affected by the economic structure. But there are significant elements that are biological, and they're not going to change just by changing the economic structure. So people on the left, and I identify with the left, people on the left have been very hostile to this, but it does seem to me that it's good science, that you can't run away from the evidence in favor of a strong evolutionary and therefore inherited component to human nature, and it explains quite a lot of tendencies about us. So the book is really an attempt to say, so what can the left do about this if we accept that an evolutionary account is scientifically correct? We can't run away from it. We have to try to channel these evolutionary tendencies in the direction of the kind of society we want. So it's important for me to emphasize that you don't derive values from science. You don't derive values from evolution, for example. That idea is clearly mistaken. But so leftists are entitled to maintain their values in terms of a more just, more equal society, or a society in which there's less suffering and so on. But they have to think about how they're going to get there on the basis of a scientific understanding of human nature. And the book throws out some suggestions in terms of doing that, in terms of using, firstly, not viewing evolutionary psychology in terms of saying, well, everything is, we're all bound to be selfish in a narrow sense. We're all bound to be in this struggle of nature red in tooth and claw and so on. There's a lot more to evolutionary psychology than that, clearly, and it says that we have, for example, strong tendencies towards reciprocity. We have capacities for various kinds of altruism, although exactly how far that goes, of course, is a big debate within evolutionary psychology. But the left has to familiarize itself with these ideas and then try and develop structures that will use these tendencies for the common good and for the basic ideas that the left stands for.
Well, and to build on what you said, this is a frequent criticism, wrong criticism, that I hear of from detractors of EP, short for evolutionary psychology, where they, exactly as you said, assume that you are taking a moral position by providing a scientific explanation for some otherwise reprehensible act, right? So if you explain something that you've written about, say infanticide, David Sloan Wilson, the evolutionary biologist, in one of his books, 2007 books, talks about sort of the three conditions where it might be adaptive for infanticide, human infanticide, to occur. So if the parents have lack of resources to successfully rear the child, if the child is born with certain, is of poor genetic quality, whatever that might mean, or if there is a great threat of typically paternal uncertainty, but the more general term is parental uncertainty, because there are cases where there could be maternal uncertainty. So these three conditions are viable conditions that might make it, quote, adaptive for infanticide to take place. Now, of course, then what people will jump is that, oh, you're offering justification for infanticide, or if you explain some adaptive explanation for rape or sexual infidelity, you're using science to explain these, reprehensible realities. And of course, the argument that I always give them is the following, and you tell me if it's a good analogy. I mean, explaining why pancreatic cancer exists doesn't mean you are for pancreatic cancer. It doesn't mean you are justifying pancreatic cancer. It means that if you want to understand it, you have to study it from a good scientific basis. Yet somehow, if you use this exact same logic for immoral situations, you're a Nazi. And I'm sure of course, in your work, you've seen this, correct?
Oh, I've seen it many times. Yeah, I think it's actually a very common fallacy. In fact, it's a fallacy that goes back quite a long way. We were just talking about John Stuart Mill and his views about freedom of expression. He also wrote an excellent essay called On Nature, in which, back in the mid 19th century, he's already saying no term is more abused and causes more confusion and poor thinking than the use of the term nature and natural. And we see that in exactly what you're talking about, because what people are thinking is, oh, so the evolutionary psychologist has said that infanticide is natural, or that rape is natural, or whatever else it might be. And therefore, they must have said it's good, because, don't we all want what's natural? Don't we walk into the health food store and look for the brand of cereal that says all natural, right? But this is clearly a mistake. There is no moral purpose in nature. It was not designed to produce the best outcome. It's pretty easy to see in various ways that that's not the case. So the fact that we have an explanation of something, and that it, in some way, it links to one element of human nature, doesn't mean at all that we are justifying it, and also doesn't mean that we shouldn't oppose it. And part of the point I make in my little book, A Darwinian Left, is that if we do understand something as being in some way related to something that we inherit from our ancestors, it's important to know that, because it's important to know then that it will resurface under different situations, and we're going to have to guard against it. If we think that it's harmful, that it's not part of the kind of society we would like to build, then we have to understand it in order to combat it more effectively.
And then even in a more practical context, you know, developing products that are going to be maximally commercially successful in the marketplace, right? I argue, say, when I'm lecturing to my students, that having a good understanding of human nature, uh, of which an instantiation of that is when I put on my hat as a consumer, ultimately will make me a better marketer, because many of the, you know, most successful products are those that by definition are congruent with our human nature. And now if I create a product that is incongruent with human nature, I could probably expect that it will fail. And the classic example that I give, but there are many others. You know, a few years ago there was a company that tried to develop. I don't remember the name of the company, but that tried to develop romance novels where they wanted to alter the archetype of the male hero. If you traditionally look at male heroes in romance novels, whether it be, you know, in Nigeria or in Japan or in Canada, it's the exact same male archetype, precisely because these forms of literature, if we can call them that, are geared towards women. And so if you want to understand women's evolved mating preferences, study the male archetype in that cultural form. Well, this company, coming from a standard social science perspective of, you know, we're infinitely malleable, thought that, well, no, we want to break free of those archetypes and those shackles. And so they created a new male hero who was more sensitive, who sucked his thumb, who cried in a fetal position. Well, guess what? It didn't sell, right? So there are very real. It's not just sort of esoteric theorizing amongst scientists and philosophers. There are real practical value to having an accurate understanding of human nature, right?
Absolutely, I think there is, and I think for that matter, you know, parents who've had children of more than one sex will probably realize the same thing. If they want to give their child a present that the child will use, you know, maybe giving a truck to your daughter is not the best thing to do. You know,
Oh,
I've had that.
I've written extensively about this. I'll send you some stuff.
Okay,
Yeah.
right. I've had that experience.
Right, yeah, exactly. Well, I've always joked that the social constructivists who argue that uh, toy preferences are just part of some evil, you know, patriarchal, arbitrary sexist stuff clearly have not had children of both sexes. There's no other possible way to explain such profound stupidity, right? But there you
Hmm.
go. But continue.
We tried for a while back in the 70s, but you know,
Ah, right. But you were
yeah,
disabused of that notion.
yeah.
So continuing with this evolutionary angle. So of course you're obviously well informed in evolutionary theory. Daniel Dennett is, of course, Donald Campbell. Uh, one can say the founder of evolutionary epistemology, the idea that knowledge itself is prone to a selectionist mechanism. So there are definitely some very prominent philosophers who are uh, evolutionary inspired. Yet, I think it would be correct to say that the large majority of philosophers go about their days blissfully detached and decoupled from evolutionary theory. Well, first, is that true? And if so, why is that? Is it for the same reasons that this happens in the social sciences, or is there something unique about the decoupling of evolutionary theory from philosophy?
Yeah, I'm thinking as you speak about whether you're right to say the large majority of philosophers. My contacts are mostly with people who do ethics and social philosophy, political philosophy, and so on. And although certainly there are significant numbers of those philosophers who, despite the area they're working in, do go about their business pretty much ignoring evolutionary theory. I wouldn't say anymore that it's a large majority.
Okay.
I'm not sure whether it's a majority at all. It would depend a bit on the areas they work in. But I think there's quite a lot of interest in evolutionary theory among philosophers working in that area, both in terms of the normative discussions, the kind of things that we were just talking about that I wrote about in Darwinian Left, um, and also in terms of understanding moral judgments. I think the work of people like Josh Green at Harvard and Jonathan Haidt now at NYU, has been taken up by philosophers. Green himself has a PhD in philosophy, although he now works in psychology. And philosophers certainly read it, and there's lots of discussions of his work and of other related work. So I think that now many philosophers working in that area, at least, are aware of what's going on and find it interesting and important to think about.
Well, that's comforting. But I guess maybe I was thinking about the greater field of philosophy, and maybe thinking specifically. And I want your opinion of these guys. I was thinking maybe of postmodernists who would be antithetical to evolutionary theory to the extent that there are no truths, there are no human universals, and so on. Jacques Derrida, Jacques Lacan, Michel Foucault. I've written about those guys and made my position clear on them. But you're the expert. Tell us what you think about the movement in general and these guys in particular.
Yes, well, I mean, I'm not sure that I really even think of them as philosophers in the sense that I understand the term, and that's why, you know, when you make statements about what the vast majority of philosophers are thinking or doing, I tend not to think about them. I mean, it really is a different tradition, you know, and I understand that people would say, well, it is part of the continental European philosophical tradition, but to me, philosophy ought to proceed by way of argument and you know, attempts to present your views, your theses clearly, and to prevent reasons and arguments for holding them, and then to listen to make objections, for other philosophers to make objections, and then to counter those objections. And the people that you just mentioned, Derrida and Foucault and others, are not really doing that. I mean, they are giving performances in some way, whether speaking or writing, which are intended to appeal and persuade in some sense. But when you try to analyze it and get clear exactly what they're saying and why they're saying it and how they're defending it, it's I don't find the sort of the philosophical standards of argument that I'm familiar with, that I'm used to, and that I value. But if we do look at them, then certainly you're right. You know, again, I guess very often they come out of this rather loosely Marxist kind of background. You know, not exactly, but within that kind of tradition, and they make statements that sound profound about human beings and the human situation and so on. But they're not the kind of statements that are informed by scientific understanding of human nature. That's certainly true.
Can I be a bit less charitable than you and say that it's complete charlatanism and it is full intellectualism and a bunch of gibberish? Or am I being too harsh?
Well, you said that, not me. I'm not going to argue against you saying that. But you know, I don't want the words put into my mouth exactly. I mean, it's a large group of people. Some of them, I think, are perhaps more genuine than others in terms of what they're trying to do, and may have had some interesting things to say. The problem is that, you know, it's become a kind of a field that has spread, and that other people, you know, departments are influenced by this. So people see that they have to do it this way if they want to advance their careers. At least in the English-speaking world, it's not really very influential in philosophy departments. Right. It's more influential in the departments of cultural studies, right, or something of that sort, what used to be literature departments, but are now taken a different tack. And of course, it has influence in areas like anthropology and so on to some extent, and sociology. And that does seem to me a pity, because I value what those disciplines did in the past, and I think now they're not doing it to the same extent. And I think there are a lot of students who are actually finding it hard to see, you know, what's going on here and why they should do this. So I think it's been detrimental to the disciplines that have adopted this way of thinking.
In the social sciences, I would think, and I'm not sure exactly when the fulcrum would have, you know, swung, but I think probably the infusion of postmodernist thinking in some of the social sciences maybe peaked around the mid-90s. But I would say that today you see a lot less of it. And certainly, for example, in consumer behavior, there was a time in the early 90s when I was getting my doctoral training where in some of the elite journals you'd have all sorts of postmodernist gibberish. And now you almost don't find it. So my feeling is that it was a fad that was driven by a few. I mean, you use the word performance, and I think that's actually a very accurate term, because I think they were actors. They're akin to religious prophets who have charismatic personalities who get up and enunciate all sorts of pseudo profundity. And usually, what the audience member will do is say, "Geez, if I don't understand what this guy's saying, it can't be that he is uttering gibberish. It must be that I'm too stupid to understand the nuance of his sophisticated mind." But I think the jig is up, and I think that in the future we'll look back at much of those writings as a little asterisk. That's my
Yeah.
thinking.
I hope you're right about that, and
Yeah,
I think quite likely you are.
yeah,
Yeah, I think that may be passing, as I say, more in some areas, some places than others. It's been interesting to see more analytic philosophy being done in continental Europe itself now. Certainly in Germany, there's quite a lot going on where there used to be very little. In France, even, I'm getting there's more attention to the work that I do, for example, than there used to be. France lagged behind a lot of other European countries in terms of when my books would get translated into French and how much discussion there would be of them. But I certainly see that changing too.
is there in philosophy? I mean, if you remember at the turn, I think, of the 20th century, I don't know if it was David Hilbert, there was a mathematics conference where all the famous mathematicians got together to say, these are the 10 problems that we have to solve. Is there a sort of similar list in philosophy? I mean, yes, the problem of consciousness, I guess, would be sort of the big one. What are some of the other ones that sort of are the holy grail of most philosophers, irrespective of which tradition they come from, that, everybody agrees we need to solve those particular problems?
Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned a good one: consciousness, the relation between consciousness and the brain and matter and so on. I mean, we can understand in scientific terms that if you do certain things to the brain, you affect people's consciousness. But how something that is a matter of material substance affects something that clearly isn't, or seems clearly not to be anyway, from the point of view of our phenomenal experience of it, that's a major question. What else is there? I suppose questions about the objectivity of knowledge is a question that you mentioned, and certainly we were talking about postmodernists who I think have a very naive kind of relativism about that. But there are real discussions about how can we get at, or can we get outside this kind of circle of our concepts, where one thing reinforces another, and we seem to be, on some views anyway, unable to actually get in contact with reality. We can only get in contact with, we can only judge things in terms of whether they cohere with other beliefs that we have. So that's the basic problem of epistemology,
Right.
I would say, and that's certainly an important question. In ethics, we've got a lively debate going on again now about the objectivity of ethics, where probably you would have to say that from the rise of logical positivism in the mid-20th century, just beginning with A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth and Logic in the 30s, we had a period where it became probably the dominant view anyway, certainly the fashionable, interesting view was to say that ethics, there can be no truths in terms of moral judgments. Ethics can't be true or false. It can only be expressions of our emotions or attitudes. And that prevailed for quite a long time, but I would say there's been an interesting shift in a different direction coming from philosophers like Derek Parfit in particular, his recent big 2-volume work on what matters. And I've been involved in editing a volume of critical discussion of that, which will come out, I guess, by the end of this year, called Does Anything Really Matter? And Parfit is now, has just completed actually a 3rd volume of On What Matters, which responds to some of those essays. And that should be out around the end of this year as well. So that's an ongoing discussion. And other philosophers like Thomas Scanlon at Harvard and Tom Nagel at just retired from NYU certainly contributed to that. So that would be a big issue. And then in terms of normative ethics, I suppose the big debate is whether some form of consequentialism is the most defensible moral theory. That is some view that says what's right or wrong depends on what will have the best consequences.
And actually, that was gonna be my next question. Contrasting deontological ethics to consequentialist ethics. I recently did a YouTube clip where I discussed these two ethical systems in relation to a movie that came out in 2007. I mean, one of the things that's beautiful about movies is that they oftentimes, of course, mimic important things that happen to humans, right? And so anyways, you might want to check that out. So I guess my question regarding this dichotomy is, is there research that has looked at the typical personality profile of the individual that is most likely to be deontologically bent, for lack of a better way to explain it, versus the guy who is a consequentialist? And so, for example, let me just start off by giving an example. So I would imagine that if you are very religious, perhaps a intuitive hypothesis might be, well, that might fit well with, almost by definition, with a deontological bent. So is there research that tries to look at individual differences in how I live my life according to one or the other of these two systems?
Well, yes, there is. I mean, there is some research going on, again, by some of the people in psychology that I mentioned that is touching upon that. Joshua Green and Jonathan Haidt have written about that kind of issue. And I suppose Green's work is suggesting that people who give more immediate responses, in other words, you describe some situation and they basically are just saying, "Oh, yuck," and because they're saying, "Oh, yuck," they then go on to say, "That's wrong." Green's view is that those people are more likely to make deontological judgments. He uses the famous trolley problem, different variants of that to ask people. Whereas people who are using the cognitive elements of their brain or elements of their brain associated with cognitive processing are more likely to come to a consequentialist conclusion. So those are some general characteristics, and I think it would be interesting to follow them up further in a variety of ways. And of course, there's been pushback against that from other people who are saying, no, there are deontological views that are actually have quite a strong cognitive component. So yeah, that's part of it. There are also people trying to look at what is different about the brains of people who are, for example, psychopathic. Is that a question of lacking some sort of empathetic or sympathetic, some emotional basis, or is there some cognitive flaw going on as well? So there are a number of areas of research that relate to that. In terms of linking it with religion, as you did, that may be something that would hold up as a statistical generalization, but it certainly doesn't work for everyone. Sure. And there clearly have been people who are quite religious, but also adopt a consequentialist ethic. My own professor at Oxford, R.M. Hare, when I was a student there, certainly considered himself a Christian, but he was also a consequentialist, a utilitarian of a certain type.
Now, this is not quite the same thing as the dichotomy that we just spoke of, but the idea of moral relativism, right, is something that, of course, has become quite pervasive amongst many of the folks that populate certainly the social sciences. The idea that who are we to judge the moral guidelines of another culture, and more generally, this is cultural relativism. Sam Harris tells a great story, which I think you could find on YouTube, where he engages a bioethicist who is who sits on the president of the United States Commission on Bioethics, and apparently she was a moral relativist, and so he tries to push her and asks, I mean, surely you can't believe that everything is, morally relativistic. So if I gave you the example, this is him speaking. So if I gave you the example that there is some culture that basically says that every fourth child we shall gouge its eyes because so it can walk towards God blindly or something like this, would you accept that that's something that you could support or condemn? And she said, well, hey, if that's their religious narrative, who am I to? And so to me, it seemed quite extraordinary. I'm guessing to Sam as well, that a bioethicist who sits on the president's commission on bioethics didn't quite have the fine-tuned moral compass to say that the gouging of every fourth child's eyes is a reprehensible reality. What's your view on that?
Well, of course, it's a reprehensible reality. I'll have to look up the clip because I'm curious as to who this person could have been.
Right.
Because, it's a pretty naive position, really, to say, on the one hand, say I'm a moral relativist, and on the other hand, say I need to respect other cultures. Because actually those two are incompatible. And the example of this that I quote to my students, I give them a lecture that talks about moral relativism early in their ethics course, comes from when the British were ruling India, and the British government tried to ban, or did ban, the practice of sutti, which was a practice where when your husband died and his was burnt, there was a funeral pyre, the widow was supposed to throw herself on the funeral pyre and incinerate herself, burn herself to death. And there was, this wasn't a totally voluntary act, as you can imagine. There was great social pressure on the widow to do this. So the British banned it. And a group of Hindu leaders came up to see Colonel, Major General, I can't remember his title, Napier, who was the British commander-in-chief at the area. And they said, look, it's our custom for widows to burn themselves on the funeral pyre of their husbands. And you should respect our custom. And Napier replied, well, it's our custom in the country where I come from that when men force women to burn themselves to death, we hang them. So you should respect our custom. We're going to continue to practice. You practice your custom, we'll practice our custom. And if you're really a relativist, there's no response to that, right? I mean, if your custom is, in fact, if your custom is to conquer other countries and force them to follow your own customs, then as a moral relativist, you can't object to that either. So the position doesn't support the view that a lot of people think is a nice position, that, we should be less arrogant and more respectful of other cultures. That moral relativism doesn't imply that. That's a different argument that you would have to make and that you might want to make from a non-relativist objectivist ethic.
Yeah, that's a good point. We've actually had to deal with this issue in our Canadian politics because our current Prime Minister, who is the son of Pierre Trudeau. The current Prime Minister is Justin Trudeau. Pierre Trudeau was the architect of the political philosophy of multiculturalism being enacted in Canada. And so a downstream effect of multiculturalism is, of course, a bent towards cultural/moral relativism, where you don't make any pronouncements against some reprehensible realities as practiced by another culture. And so in the case of Justin Trudeau, who at the time was a minister in Parliament before he was Prime Minister, he got very upset that some politician had used the words barbaric to describe, I think, child brides and honor killings and female genital mutilation. And what had upset him was not those realities, but rather that you would be so indecent as to call them barbaric. And again, I think from my perspective, somebody who doesn't have the moral compass to navigate through this rather simple, quote, dilemma, maybe is not somebody that I'd like to have him lead me, but there you go.
Well, what are your choices? I wasn't too keen on his predecessor, I have to say.
True. Yeah. Well, I mean, some people said that one of the reasons that Justin Trudeau won, other than that he was very handsome and so on, an argument that I actually made, is that it was sort of a no vote against Harper. Not so much that people liked Trudeau, but that they really despised Harper. So be that as it may. Of course, it would be remiss of me to not talk about your animal work, and then maybe at the end we could conclude with some of your recent stuff in effective altruism, which is of course a very interesting topic. So let's briefly talk about your animal liberation book and all of your works in this area. But I'll start it off with a personal anecdote. Many of these conversations are really become poignant when you share something of yourself. I remember I was maybe 5 years old in Lebanon. As you may or may not know, I grew up in Lebanon, and then my family escaped the Civil War to come to Canada. And I was maybe 5 years old and seeing I think it was one of the Benji movies. There was a dog called Benji, and I think there were several movies. And in this particular movie, this is probably early 70s. The dog is lost, and so you sort of see his trials and tribulations as he's lost and scared. And I was simply inconsolable. I was crying like a mad. I mean, you just couldn't console me. My parents were trying to explain to me that don't worry, this is not real. It's not really happening to him. And this is sort of the earliest memory I have of my profound love for animals. I mean, the thing that I'm simply unable to ever watch, more than seeing ISIS decapitating people, is any animal cruelty. I don't know if that says something bad about me or something good, but I simply cannot tolerate animal cruelty. And so maybe that's the original place where, if you like, I bonded with your work on an intellectual level. But so anyway, so give us sort of how you got into this problem. Was it something personal that got you involved? Was it just an interesting intellectual exercise? Give us the background to your involvement in this
No,
important issue.
I think I'm rather different, actually. I mean, I don't have any companion animals, and I don't
Okay.
particularly want to. And I don't have deep emotional attachments to animals. Of course, I don't like to watch cruelty to animals. I don't like to watch cruelty to humans either. But I did come to this through philosophy, through being, being interested in questions about equality, equal consideration of interests. Why it's important to, and we'll get onto this in a moment, why it's important to be concerned about the interests of everyone, whether they're near or far. And then I got challenged to say, well, why shouldn't we be concerned about the interests of non-human animals? Why does the fact that there are different species mean that their suffering doesn't matter? And once that question is put, I think there isn't really a good answer. If we think we ought to be concerned about the interests of people living in Africa, that's geography is not relevant. Well, species is not relevant in itself either. I mean, of course, animals of different species may have different interests, but if they're capable of suffering, they have an interest in not feeling pain. If they can enjoy their lives, they have an interest in having pleasant lives, enjoyable lives. And once I started to think about this, then I realized that, in fact, we have these vast industries that are committed to using animals merely as things without any real concern for their well-being. So the whole of the factory farming industry that produces most of the meat and eggs and a lot of dairy for affluent countries and increasingly for countries like China as well, is premised on the idea that these are just machines, that we feed them grain or something cheap like that, and we get meat and eggs out at the end. And as long as something doesn't interfere with the efficiency of the production process, it's fine. And that's why we've ended up with literally billions worldwide, tens of billions of animals locked away indoors in conditions that are completely unsuited for their nature. And, we were just talking about human nature and how there's a biological component to it that you don't change by changing the environment. Well, you certainly don't change the nature of a hen by putting her inside a cage for all of her life with 4 or 5 other hens where she's crowded up and can't move around properly. She's still got natural instincts. You can take a hen that's never, ever in its life seen grass or been able to dust bathe or chase insects. You take her out of this cage after a year or so or more of living in it, and within an hour or two, she'll be doing all those things. She'll be chasing insects around. She'll be dust bathing. When she's ready to lay an egg, she'll try and build a nest of the grass or straw or whatever you've got around. These animals, are really miserable in those confinement, and that was the thing that most moved me. Of course, I'm also concerned about other areas of animal abuse. To write Animal Liberation, Actually, I think if I'd been the kind of person that you described yourself as, not being able to look at animal
You
cruelty,
wouldn't have been able
I
to do
probably
this. Yeah,
I
right.
couldn't have done the research
Yeah.
because, gee, some of the stuff about experiments on animals,
Oh,
particularly, was
geez.
also quite horrendous to look at.
Don't give me the details. I don't want to hear
Yeah.
it. Yeah, go on. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah. So, but basically, as I say, it was an ethical argument, and it still is an ethical argument that uh, we should not discount the interests of beings because they're not members of our species.
Right.
If they don't have interests, if they can't feel pain, sure, that's a relevant factor. If we think that they maybe have some capacity for pain, but it's more limited, that's relevant. We think that their interests are different. They don't have interest in getting an education, for instance, as human children do. That's obviously relevant. But just the fact that they're not human beings, if we're talking about inflicting pain or suffering on them, that shouldn't be relevant at all.
Now, so what is it that causes? So, of course, one of your great ideas from your work on animal liberation is bringing them into our moral circle. So, what is it that makes it that for many people, and certainly the ones who are involved in many of the horrifying practices that you speak of, what is it that allows them to create the clear delineation between humans and animals? Now, I could think, for example, in the religious narrative, you've got a clear narrative that says, look, we're special, we're in the image of God, animals don't have souls, whatever. And so I could use that to create that line between me and animals. But for most people, religious and non-religious, is there a general mechanism that doesn't allow them to have the compassion that you're speaking of?
Uh, I don't think that there's a general mechanism. I think a lot of people do have some concern for animals, but it's almost that we turn away from it because I think the fact that we eat animals is a really critical element of this, and because we eat them, because we've grown up eating them, that's been a habit. Our society does it. I think it's hard for us to look honestly at what's going on, so we turn away from it. I don't really like to make comparisons between the Holocaust and the treatment of animals, but in terms of the psychology of, you can imagine decent Germans not really wanting to investigate what was happening to the Jews who were being deported at the time when my grandparents were being deported, because if they did so, what would they do about it? It would be, very difficult. So they just look away. And although it's not so difficult, of course, to stop eating animals, but I think a lot of people think of that as being difficult in a social and cultural sense, and so they don't really want to look too closely at it. But in terms of seeing cruelty to a dog in the street in front of them, I think most people would be horrified by that and would do something about it if
Right.
they could.
There is actually a recent study that was published maybe in the last 2 years, and I can't remember the reference, but if I'll uncover it, I'll send it to you if you're not already familiar with it, where they provided people with different scenarios of who you would go into a building to save, and actually puppies won out against I don't know, some random stranger in many cases. Certainly a non-negligible number of people
Yeah.
cared more about, and so in their case, they're certainly including them within our moral circle. I know that when we have two Belgian Shepherds, well, we had two Belgian Shepherds, one of whom died in May 2012, and one of the things that used to really upset me, and I wrote an ode to my dog when he passed away, where I mentioned this. One of the things that really upset me is when somebody would, in a somewhat inappropriate manner, from my view, would say, "Yeah, I know, you lost it." It's as if he was part of your family. He's almost as if, right? So I mean, well, no, it's not as if. It's not almost. He really was. I mean, I cared
Yeah.
about that dog as much as I do about anybody else, and yet from his perspective, he was actually saying that, of course, you care about him. He's almost as important as humans, which speaks to your point, right?
Yeah, but then there's the question about other animals, right?
Right.
Because just as your dogs you knew had a personality and cared and so on, I mean, so do the animals that most people eat, right?
Yeah.
And do you extend that to pigs or cows or chickens, whatever animals it is, who also are actually individuals when you get to know them. And unfortunately, as you say, in this research, maybe people said they would save a puppy. How many people would say they would save a pig?
True.
probably far fewer. And if you said save a chicken, it would be fewer still, I'm sure.
But now, is that because you somehow commodify the pig as a semi non-sentient being, whereas the
Yeah, and
dog,
we don't think of them as individuals, whereas we
yeah,
get to know dogs as individuals. But
it,
people who adopt chickens, for example, raise chickens themselves, a few of them, or there are some people who take rescued chickens from battery cages. They do have individual personalities, no question about it, and can
you,
feel differently.
you know, I do eat meat, and you now know about my love for animals. So it is something that I struggle with. For a few years, I went full vegetarian for about 3 years, and then I succumbed to a piece of chicken, and then fell back off the wagon, so to speak. Uh, you're right. I mean, there is a hypocrisy there. In my case, what I do, and I say this jokingly, that I can never eat something that looks as though it's an animal form. So as long as I get the piece of steak and I can convince myself that it grows on trees, then some. Of course, I'm joking. I'm being facetious. But we have an uncanny ability to find ways, as you said, to turn away. Uh, am I being bad? You're the big world renowned bioethicist. Am I being a bad person for loving animals so much and yet succumbing to eating meat?
Yeah, I mean, if you ask me, honestly, I think you
Really?
are,
Okay.
because you know this, right? I
Right.
mean, sure, you may have this. This is again the kind of the yuck reaction, if you like. You have this yuck reaction to an animal like, I don't know, maybe a fish, a whole fish that you see on your plate,
Right.
looking up at you with its eye still there, but you know that the steak or the pork chop or whatever else it might have been, the piece of chicken was an animal. You also know, unless you're extremely careful where you get it from, that it's
Right.
very likely to have been badly mistreated. And if you're buying it or you're willing to consume it so other people are buying it for you, you're complicit in that.
Right.
And I do think that
You're
we
right.
need to get beyond that stage.
Now, so would your position be that, as let's suppose we lived in an ideal world where all of these horrifying conditions were eradicated, so that every animal who we're going to end up eating was treated in the most humane way possible? Would at that point would you feel ethically comfortable in saying yes, we could eat meat, or no? I mean, we don't have the right to be consuming other sentient beings. What's your position?
Well, my ethics isn't really based on, rights. It is based on consequences. So if animals were actually really living good lives and were humanely killed, and people argue then otherwise they wouldn't have existed at all, and so on, it's a different ethical question.
Right.
I certainly would not be nearly as critical, because I think that's much more an open question that reasonable people can have an ethical debate on. Whereas I think supporting factory farming as it exists today is really not an open ethical question at
All
all.
right. I will pass on instructions to my wife to look for free roaming beef.
Okay.
You've gotten me now.
Yeah. Okay.
Now you've triggered my guilt, Peter. Let's move on to our last general topic. Of course, I could keep you here for another 5 hours. Effective altruism. I saw you actually speak about this at Ciudad, where we met in Mexico. And I loved some of the examples that you gave. Wonderful stuff. Why don't you tell us about effective altruism, and then I'll see if I could interject a few evolutionary snippets into the discussion.
Mm. Well, effective altruism is an emerging movement of people who have decided to make improving the world a significant part of their lives. They're not, this may be sort of getting ahead of what you're going to talk about, human nature. They're not assuming that everybody can be complete altruists and we can live as saints, but they're just saying, given that we have basic, security, economic security of our needs and so on, we can think that it's a worthwhile thing to do, to think about what we can personally do to make the world a better place. And that can be a significant part of our lives and one of our aims. And in doing that, we want to use our resources, whether that's time or money, whatever it might be. We want to use them as effectively as possible. So it's not good enough just to say, well, this is making the world a better place. We need to ask ourselves, am I doing the most good I can do? And that's the title of my recent book on this, The Most Good You Can Do. Um, uh, And so for that, we want to look at different charities. Again, we don't want to just give impulsively. Somebody puts a brochure in our hand showing a sick kid. We don't want to say, oh, I want to help that child. We really should look at what the charity is doing. How transparent is it? Can it demonstrate that it gets really good value for every dollar that it is given? If not, let's find a different charity. And we now have organizations and websites like the lifeyoucansave.org, givewell.org, and Giving What We Can that assess charities and really look at what they're doing, what their impact is. So a part of the effective altruism movement is trying to get across this message that we can find really good charities that give terrific value for money in terms of what they will do with your donation to help people in much greater need than you are. And that's a worthwhile thing to do. And of course, it doesn't have to be money, as I say. It can be volunteering, time, talking about this, spreading the message. There's lots of things to do to get more people thinking like this.
Well, I receive endless messages from folks, and I'm humbled by it, who somehow, I guess, because of course I'm in the public eye, so they feel like they know me, so they'll send me, long emails describing their personal problems, asking for career advice, asking for relationship advice, and I often spend quite a bit of time, offering whatever advice that I can give. So in that sense, I guess I am being hopefully an effective altruist, maybe not on a mass scale, but certainly on individual case. But I guess so I wanted to infuse it with some evolutionary elements. We had discussed this during our lunch in Mexico. My feeling is that if we can incorporate as part of the appeal for people to engage in effective altruism some evolutionary trigger, then the appeal becomes that much more interesting. And so let me give you a banal example, which you probably are already aware of. If I simply say, hey, please give me money so that I can help the children of Africa, that's some domain general vague goal that doesn't really tickle my emotional bone. On the other hand, if you create a symbolic adoption of an individual child where you can now trigger my kin-based affective system, then I'm much more likely to jump on the bandwagon because I actually develop a bond with this child or this bear or this zebra. So have you looked at these types of issues in terms of how do we construct evolutionarily powerful appeals to get people to participate in effective altruism?
Oh, absolutely. I have looked
Okay.
at them, and I talk about them a bit in the book. But very often, exactly these evolutionary attitudes are a problem for effective altruism. I criticize the Make-A-Wish Foundation. I don't know if you are familiar with that. It's an
When the
American
kids are
foundation.
sick, yes, okay.
Yeah, so you have sick kids, often kids with cancer, and the Make-A-Wish Foundation will sort of say so, or they contact the foundation and they say, the example I use is one that got a lot of publicity. A kid who said, "I want to be Bat Kid for a day, right? So I want to dress up in Bat Kid uniform, drive around in the Batmobile with Batman, and catch the Riddler or whatever the criminal is, and so on." So people donated to the foundation to make this possible. And on average, the foundation says it costs $7,500 to make a kid's wish come true. So in other words, for an average of $7,500, the sick kid has one great day. Now, for that kind of money, you could pretty conservatively estimate save the lives of some kids, whether it's 2 or 3 or 5 is hard to say, but of some number of kids, you could save their whole lives, not just give them one good day. And I think anyone would agree that it would be better to save a sick child's life than to give a sick child one good day and then they go back to being sick and die. And of course, if it's not just one kid but more, then even more strongly. So the question is, how do organizations that are doing this, but where you can't exactly see whose life is being saved? So, for example, Against Malaria Foundation is a highly effective charity. It saves kids' lives by giving out bed nets that people use in malaria-prone regions to protect kids against malaria. You can't see which kids' lives are saved because you can't counterfactually say, if this kid hadn't been sleeping under a bed net, this kid would have got malaria and died. What you can do, of course, is to have a photo of a smiling child carrying a bed net home from the distribution center, and Against Malaria Foundation does that. But it's still, it's up against it, and it is difficult to know how, without distorting the truth behind what the work is doing, we can match the appeal of something like the Make-A-Wish Foundation, which says, here's this child, this is his name, here's his picture. He's sick, you can make his wish come true. Emotionally, that seems to be more powerful, although I think our reasoning abilities tell us that the other charity actually will do more good for kids.
Right, right. No, very, very interesting. So now, but what would you say to people who say, look, I guess that's one of the things that we touched upon during our lunch chat in Mexico. You and I might engage in reciprocal altruism for the obvious evolutionary reason. I may jump into a river to save somebody that I don't know for several clear evolutionary reasons. But somebody who comes to you, a hardened evolutionist who says, look, we haven't evolved the emotional and cognitive system to, recurringly care about what's happening to random strangers 5,000 miles away. And so the fact that most people don't care is to be expected. That's the default value of human nature. How do we get around that argument? Or get over it?
Well, I don't know the answer to getting around that argument, in the sense of how do we get most people to become effective altruists. But it's clear that some people are able to act altruistically. Exactly how this works and why is a very good question for evolutionary psychology to study. But I give many examples in my book of people who have acted altruistically in various ways, giving away, for example, as much as 95% of their income, donating a kidney to a complete stranger. A whole lot of examples of people acting altruistically.
And not necessarily super wealthy people, right?
No, the guy who was giving away 95% of his income, I think that left him with, I don't know, $10,000 or $15,000 a year. Wow. So you can do the sum. He was doing okay. He was a computer programmer or something like that. He was doing pretty well. But he was still able to live. And the guy who gave, well, there are many people who've given kidneys to strangers. The one I use in the book was a student at the time. I think there's scope for people to do more. I think that we are capable. We have this mix of capacities to reason and to work things out and to see what's the best, and these more intuitive emotional responses, which are very powerful. And maybe for some people, there's no way of getting past them. But for other people, there is ways of saying, I am going to help, even though I can't identify the individuals I'm helping. What I want to do is to do the most good that I can. And fortunately, perhaps, some of these people who seem to have a more, numerate approach to the world, in terms of saying I'd rather help more people than less, happen to have got pretty wealthy lately because they are good at computer programming or, other things along those lines, right? Bill Gates is the super nerd who started out doing this and now has the largest charitable foundation in the world. And he is exactly trying to do this, to say, we want to help people everywhere, not just the people who I can see or something like that.
Right.
And there are many others in that sort of field as well. So there are significant resources going into this now.
Let me ask you this, and last question, then we'll end it. So in my 2007 book, Evolutionary Basis of Consumption, I have a section I title Philanthropy as a Costly Signal, right? And so philanthropy, which need not fit within the rubric of what you're calling effective altruism, but philanthropy, of course, in many cases, is a form of peacocking, right? It's the Bill Gates cancer ward. It's not the random X cancer ward, right? And I mentioned it when I'm building that argument that Maimonides had talked about 8 levels of tzedakah, charity and pious giving, and that the highest level, which is almost never met, precisely because he understood human nature well, despite the fact that he wasn't an evolutionist at his time, is that both the altruist and the recipient of the altruistic act should be anonymous to one another, precisely because there can be no social benefits in people knowing that I just gave $100 million to some African cause. Does what I just said in any way fit within your rubric of effective altruism in terms of the idea that maybe some of these effective altruists are ultimately engaging in nothing but peacocking? I know it's a sinister way to look at altruism, but could that be possible?
I don't think that's true of effective altruism in general, and there isn't a Bill Gates Cancer Award because he's not doing that. But it's certainly true of a lot of charitable donations, and I think you know, a lot of them, a lot of the people who do that mostly are giving to buildings. I mean, New Yorkers will know that what used to be the Avery Fisher Concert Hall at the Lincoln Center has just become the David Geffen Concert Hall because David Geffen gave $100 million towards its renovation. So that's a good example of that. But effective altruists don't give to renovate concert halls for wealthy Manhattanites. And generally speaking, these people are not giving in ways that their name will get out there. Right? So I don't think that is what's going on. I think more of what's going on is still in evolutionary terms, we are purposive beings, right? We are beings who've evolved to have purposes, and for most of our evolutionary history, those purposes involve feeding ourselves and our kin and so on, and reproducing the rest of it. But now we can meet those needs in a small part of our time. And then we sort of think, well, what is my life all about? The philosophy begins. What do I want to do with my life? What kind of purpose can I have? I don't just want to sit on a beach all day. I don't just want to play video games. Making the world a better place would be an interesting purpose and one that is going to last me the rest of my life. And that's a fulfilling and worthwhile thing to do. That's something that I can identify myself with. So I think that's more the motivation for the effective altruist that I talk to.
And I guess I'll end it by saying you've been a effective altruist in accepting my invitation to come and share your wisdom with the world. So